The courtroom was silent. Everyone's eyes were on Officer Daniel Briggs as he laughed, loud and shameless. His voice echoed across the room, bouncing off the walls like a cruel joke. "You really think you can lecture me on the law?" he sneered, shaking his head at the woman standing in front of him. He turned to the judge and the crowd, smirking. "Look at this lady. Probably watched too many crime shows. Thinks she knows the rules better than I do." A few chuckles rippled through the room, but they died quickly when the woman didn't flinch. She just stood there, her piercing blue eyes locked on Briggs. Calm, still, unshaken. Then, she did something no one expected. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a sleek black badge, and held it up. The courtroom gasped. It wasn't a police badge. It wasn't even an FBI badge. It was from the NSA. "I don't think I know the rules, Officer Briggs," she said, her voice smooth like steel. "I do know them." Briggs' smirk vanished in an instant. His face turned pale. His hands, which had been confidently resting on his belt, twitched slightly. He swallowed hard. The woman took a step forward. The air in the room grew thick with tension. "You just mocked the wrong woman," she said. "And I never forget." The entire courtroom was frozen. No one spoke. No one even breathed. Then the judge cleared his throat, looking at the woman with newfound respect. "Miss Carter," he said slowly, "would you care to explain why an NSA operative is involved in a routine police misconduct case?" Jessica Carter smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind that made people nervous. "I'd love to," she said. And just like that, the room tilted. The world that Officer Briggs thought he controlled slipped out from under him. He had no idea that his life was about to change forever. 2 weeks earlier, it was just another cold morning in New York City. The streets were buzzing with early commuters, coffee in hand, bundled up in thick coats as they rushed to work. The city never stopped moving, never stopped breathing. Jessica Carter sat at a corner table in a quiet cafe, watching the people outside. She wasn't just watching for fun. She was watching because it was her job. Jessica had worked for the National Security Agency for over 10 years. She had seen things the average person couldn't imagine. Cyber threats, espionage, high-level criminal operations. She had been in the thick of it all. But today, she wasn't here for a government mission. Today, it was personal. Her brother, Thomas, had been arrested. The police report said he had resisted arrest, assaulted an officer, and was caught stealing from a convenience store. But Jessica knew her brother. He wasn't a criminal. He wasn't violent. Something wasn't right. She took a sip of her coffee and checked her watch. Any minute now. And then she saw him. Officer Briggs. He was laughing with his partner as they walked into the cafe, their uniforms crisp, their badges shining. He had no idea who she was. Jessica leaned back, her fingers gripping her cup as she watched them order coffee. She could feel the heat rising in her chest. She had spent the last 3 days digging into Briggs' record. What she found was ugly. Complaints from civilians. Suspicious reports of accidental injuries during arrests. Cases where the body cameras mysteriously malfunctioned. And worst of all, he was the officer who arrested Thomas. Jessica's jaw tightened. She knew what she had to do. But she had to be careful. She had to be patient. Briggs had no idea that his world was about to collapse. The courthouse was packed the day of the trial. The case against Thomas had gained attention after a video leaked online. The video showed Officer Briggs slamming Thomas against a police car, even though he wasn't fighting back. People started asking questions. Jessica sat in the audience, dressed in a simple black blazer. She didn't stand out. She looked like any other concerned citizen. But her mind was working like a machine. She had spent days preparing for this. She had contacted lawyers, spoken to witnesses, and even had a few friends at the NSA pull records. Everything she needed was in place. And now, it was time to see what Briggs would do under pressure. When Briggs took the stand, he was cocky. Too cocky. He smirked at the lawyer questioning him. He answered with short, dismissive remarks. He acted like he was untouchable. That's when Jessica stood up. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Miss, you can't just—" "I have a question for Officer Briggs," Jessica said, her voice steady. Briggs snorted. "And you are?" Jessica pulled out her badge and held it up. The courtroom went silent. Officer Briggs' smirk vanished. Jessica took a step forward. You lied in your report, she said. You tampered with evidence. And you think no one would notice? The crowd murmured. The judge leaned forward, clearly interested. Briggs opened his mouth, but no words came out. He was trapped. Jessica smiled. This was only the beginning. The silence in the courtroom stretched on like a tightrope, fragile and waiting to snap. Officer Daniel Briggs sat frozen in his chair, his eyes darting between Jessica Carter's cold, unwavering stare and the black badge she held in her hand. The judge, now fully engaged, folded his hands together and leaned forward. "Miss Carter," he said slowly, his voice cutting through the thick tension. "Are you accusing Officer Briggs of misconduct under the authority of the National Security Agency?" Jessica didn't blink. "I am." A low murmur rippled through the courtroom. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads, and the gallery leaned forward, eager to hear what came next. The prosecutor, an older man with tired eyes, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Briggs found his voice. "This is ridiculous," he barked, forcing a laugh that sounded painfully strained. "She's making things up. I don't know who she thinks she is, but she has no jurisdiction here." Jessica tilted her head slightly, her blue eyes locked onto his like a predator eyeing its prey. "Oh, but I do, Officer Briggs. You see, when you falsify reports, tamper with evidence, and violate a citizen's rights, it's not just a police matter. It becomes a federal one. And that makes it my problem." Briggs shot a desperate look at the judge. "She's lying." Jessica reached into the black leather folder she carried and pulled out a stack of documents. She walked toward the witness stand, her heels clicking against the polished floor, the sound sharp and measured. She handed the papers to the judge. "These are internal reports I obtained through legal means," she said. "They show a disturbing pattern in Officer Briggs' arrests. Repeated complaints of excessive force, mysteriously missing body cam footage, and altered incident reports that don't match the testimonies of witnesses." The judge scanned the documents. His frown deepened with every page. Briggs' partner, who had been sitting quietly at the back of the courtroom, suddenly shifted uncomfortably. He looked like he wanted to sink into his chair. Briggs gripped the wooden railing of the stand. "This is a setup. She's trying to frame me." Jessica let out a short, humorless laugh. "I don't need to frame you, Officer Briggs. You did that yourself." The judge lifted his gaze. "Miss Carter, do you have proof of specific wrongdoing related to this case?" Jessica turned and nodded toward the back of the courtroom. The doors opened, and a man walked in. He was in his late 50s, dressed in a plain brown jacket, and had a serious expression on his face. "This is Richard Gomez," Jessica announced. "He was working the night shift at the convenience store where my brother was allegedly caught stealing. And he has something to say." Briggs went pale. The courtroom held its breath. Gomez stepped forward, cleared his throat, and turned toward the judge. "Your Honor," he said, his voice firm, "Thomas Carter didn't steal anything that night. I was there the whole time. He paid for his items and was walking out when Officer Briggs and his partner pulled up. They accused him of loitering, then tried to arrest him. When he asked why, Briggs grabbed him and threw him against the squad car." Gasps echoed through the room. Jessica turned to look at Briggs, her expression unreadable. "Care to explain that?" Briggs clenched his jaw. He was sweating now, his once confident smirk completely erased. The judge took off his glasses and sighed heavily. "I think we need a recess." He slammed the gavel down. The courtroom erupted into whispers. Jessica turned and walked back to her seat. She didn't need to look back to know that Briggs was unraveling. This was only the beginning. 3 days earlier, Jessica stood in front of her brother's holding cell, gripping the cold steel bars. Thomas sat on the bench inside, his head in his hands. "Jess," he muttered, barely looking up. "What are you doing here?" Jessica swallowed the lump in her throat. She hated seeing him like this. "I'm getting you out." Thomas let out a bitter chuckle. "Good luck with that. The cops already made up their minds. They say I assaulted an officer." He looked up, his dark brown eyes filled with frustration. "You know I didn't, right?" Jessica didn't hesitate. "Of course I do." Thomas exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "It's not fair. I did everything right, Jess. I put my hands up. I didn't fight back. But that guy, Briggs, he wanted to make an example out of me. Jessica felt her fingers tighten around the bars. He picked the wrong person to mess with. Thomas looked at her. What are you going to do? Jessica's voice was ice. What I do best. For the next 3 days, Jessica didn't sleep much. She combed through arrest records, interviewed witnesses, and even made a few quiet phone calls to people who owed her favors. She had built a solid case against Briggs, but she knew the real battle would be in court. Briggs wasn't just some bad cop. He was protected. He had friends in high places. But Jessica wasn't afraid. She had taken down international cybercriminals, infiltrated foreign spy networks, and uncovered national security threats. One corrupt cop? That was nothing. Back in the present, Jessica stepped outside the courthouse and took a deep breath. The cold air felt refreshing. She checked her phone. Several missed calls from her NSA supervisor. She'd deal with that later. Right now, she had only one focus, taking down Briggs. As she turned to leave, she caught sight of Briggs standing near the steps, talking furiously with his lawyer. His face was red, his hands clenched into fists. He was losing control. Jessica smiled to herself. That was exactly what she wanted. But as she walked away, she failed to notice the dark SUV parked across the street. Inside, a man in a black suit watched her closely. He picked up his phone and made a call. She's digging too deep, he said. We need to handle this. The man listened to the response on the other end, then nodded. Understood. Then, he started the car. Jessica Carter had just stepped into something bigger than she realized, and she had no idea what was coming next. Jessica Carter had always been good at reading people. It was a skill she had sharpened over years of working in intelligence. But as she walked away from the courthouse, something felt off. The feeling crept up her spine, that familiar tingle that told her someone was watching. She didn't turn her head. Instead, she casually checked her phone, using the screen's reflection to scan her surroundings. That's when she saw it. A black SUV, parked across the street. Windows tinted just enough to make it impossible to see who was inside. It didn't belong there. Jessica's heartbeat slowed, not from fear, but from focus. She had seen cars like that before. Unmarked. Government-issued. Someone was watching her. She casually adjusted her coat and turned down a side street. She walked at a normal pace. Running would make it obvious she had noticed. But she listened carefully for the sound of an engine roaring to life behind her. Sure enough, the SUV pulled away from the curb. Jessica took a sharp right, slipping into an alleyway. She moved quickly now, cutting through back streets, using her knowledge of the city to lose her tail. She ducked into a small bookstore, walked straight to the back, and crouched behind a shelf. She grabbed a book off the rack, pretending to browse while she watched the entrance through the reflection of a nearby glass case. A man in a black suit walked past the store. He stopped outside, looking around, his sharp eyes scanning the street. Jessica recognized that look. This wasn't a local cop. This wasn't some random thug. This was someone trained. Someone who knew how to track a target. And she was that target. The man lingered for a moment, then pulled out his phone and made a call. Jessica couldn't hear what he said, but she could read his lips. She's gone. Jessica exhaled slowly, closing the book in her hands. She wasn't just dealing with Officer Briggs anymore. Something bigger was at play, and she needed to find out what. That night, Jessica sat in her apartment, her laptop open in front of her. The dim glow from the screen cast a soft light across the room. She had spent the last few hours combing through more reports, digging deeper into Briggs' history. What she found sent a chill through her. Briggs wasn't acting alone. There were patterns in his cases, connections that stretched beyond his precinct. Other officers with similar accusations, dismissed complaints, missing body cam footage. And then she found something even worse. A name. James Holloway. A former police captain turned private security consultant. His company worked with government agencies, providing specialized services for law enforcement. But Jessica knew what that really meant. Holloway's company didn't just provide security. They provided cover-ups. Briggs was just a small piece of a much bigger puzzle. Jessica leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. If Holloway was involved, this wasn't just about police misconduct anymore. This was organized, corrupt, dangerous. and someone didn't want her digging any further. She thought about the black SUV, the man in the suit. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The next morning, Jessica walked into the courthouse with her head held high. Today was another day in her brother's trial, and she wasn't about to let fear stop her from exposing the truth. As she took her seat, she noticed Briggs sitting across the room. He looked different, less cocky, more nervous. His fingers tapped against the table. His eyes flickered toward the entrance every few seconds. Jessica smirked. He knew. He knew his world was falling apart. The judge entered, and the courtroom settled. The prosecutor stood and called their next witness, Richard Gomez, the store clerk who had come forward. Gomez took the stand, cleared his throat, and began his testimony. Everything was going according to plan, until the doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Jessica turned, expecting to see a latecomer slipping in quietly. Instead, 4 men in suits walked in, and they were heading straight for her. Her stomach tightened. This wasn't good. One of them leaned down and whispered something to the judge. The judge frowned but nodded. Then the man turned to Jessica. "Miss Carter," he said in a low, professional voice. "We need to speak with you. Now." Jessica's muscles tensed. She glanced at her brother, then at Briggs, who was watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. She turned back to the man in the suit. "And who exactly are you?" The man pulled out a badge. Jessica's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't police. It wasn't FBI. It was Department of Homeland Security. And just like that, everything changed. The courtroom felt like it had shrunk. Jessica Carter's pulse remained steady, but she was already calculating the situation in her head. 4 men. Homeland Security. Public approach. No immediate aggression. That meant 2 things. They wanted to make this look official, and they weren't here to arrest her, yet. She slowly rose from her seat, locking eyes with the man who had spoken. "Am I under arrest?" "No," he replied, "but you need to come with us. Now." The judge adjusted his glasses. "Gentlemen, this is a court of law. Unless you have a warrant." "This is a national security matter," the lead agent interrupted. He turned back to Jessica. "Please, Miss Carter." Jessica clenched her jaw. She didn't want to make a scene. Not here. Not in front of Thomas. She glanced at her brother. His eyes were wide with worry. "I'll be fine," she mouthed. Then, without another word, she walked between the agents, letting them escort her out. Briggs, still seated at the defendant's table, watched her leave, his face a mess of confusion and relief. For a second, Jessica thought she saw something else in his eyes. Fear. She tucked that piece of information away. Whoever these men were, they weren't just here for her. They were here because of what she had uncovered. 20 minutes later, a government building in Lower Manhattan. The office was cold, the lights too bright, the windows covered. Standard interrogation setup. Jessica sat at the steel table, calm and composed. Across from her sat the lead agent, his badge resting on the table. Agent Wallace. He studied her for a long moment, then leaned forward. "You've been looking into Daniel Briggs." Jessica met his stare. "And?" Wallace's lips pressed together. "We need you to stop." Jessica blinked once. Slowly. Then she laughed. "Excuse me? You're playing in dangerous waters, Miss Carter," Wallace continued. "You're an intelligence officer, not a cop. You know as well as I do that there are lines we don't cross." Jessica tilted her head. "I don't cross lines. I expose the people who do." Wallace sighed, rubbing his forehead. "You think this is just about a bad cop? It's bigger than that." Jessica didn't break eye contact. "I know." Wallace's expression shifted. Just slightly. He hadn't expected that. Jessica leaned forward now. "Briggs isn't just a rogue officer. He's part of something organized. Something connected to James Holloway." Wallace exhaled sharply. He looked almost tired. "You need to let this go." Jessica's eyes narrowed. "Why?" Wallace didn't answer. Jessica folded her arms. "I assume you're not going to arrest me. Because if you could, you already would have." Silence. Jessica stood. "Then we're done here." She turned to leave, but Wallace's next words stopped her cold. "Your brother doesn't have time for you to play hero." Jessica froze. Slowly, she turned back around. Wallace sighed again. You're drawing attention to this case. And the people you're digging into? They don't leave loose ends. He leaned forward. If you keep this up, they will come after you. And if they can't get to you, they'll get to Thomas. Jessica's fingers curled into fists. Wallace stood up, adjusting his suit jacket. This isn't a warning, Miss Carter. It's a fact. He picked up his badge, slipping it back into his pocket. You've got a choice to make. Walk away, and this all goes away. Keep going. He shook his head. And you might not like what happens next. Jessica didn't move. Wallace walked past her, pausing at the door. For what it's worth, he said without looking at her, I respect what you're trying to do. But trust me, some fights? You don't want to win. Then he left. Jessica stood in the silent room, her heartbeat slow and steady. She wasn't scared. She was angry. And now? Now she knew she was closer to the truth than ever before. That night, AA parking garage in Midtown. Jessica moved quickly, staying in the shadows. She had made a decision the moment Wallace left that office. She wasn't backing down, but she needed help, which was why she was here. She spotted the man she was looking for near a parked black sedan. He was in his late 40s, with graying hair and sharp eyes. No uniform, no badge, but he didn't need one. Jessica walked straight toward him. Hello, Captain Holloway. Holloway didn't even look surprised. He just sighed. You really should have walked away, Miss Carter. Jessica smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. Too late for that. Holloway studied her for a moment, then smirked. You've got guts. I'll give you that. But guts don't mean a thing if you don't know when to stop. Jessica stepped closer. I know exactly when to stop. And that's when men like you stop getting away with this. Holloway chuckled. You think you know everything, don't you? Jessica pulled out a flash drive from her pocket and dangled it between her fingers. I know enough. Holloway's smirk faded. Jessica leaned in slightly. I have records, Holloway. Transfers. Reports. Names. All of it. Holloway's jaw tightened. Jessica tilted her head. Do you know what happens when someone like me hands this kind of information to the right people? A tense silence. Then, Holloway's expression changed. He smiled. Not out of amusement, but out of something colder. Jessica barely had time to register the shift before she heard the click. A gun, pressed lightly against her side. Holloway's voice was low, almost amused. You're smart, Carter. But not smart enough. Jessica didn't move. She had expected this. What Holloway didn't know was that she had expected him, and he had just made his last mistake. Jessica Carter felt the cold steel of the gun against her ribs. The parking garage was eerily quiet, the only sound the distant hum of traffic from the street above. She could hear Holloway's slow, measured breathing, could feel his smirk without even looking at him. You're smart, Carter, he repeated, pressing the barrel slightly harder against her side. But not smart enough. Jessica kept her face neutral, her hands loose at her sides. But inside, she was calculating, timing, waiting. Holloway thought he had control. He was wrong. Jessica exhaled softly, shaking her head. You just made the biggest mistake of your life. Holloway chuckled. Oh yeah? And what mistake is that? Jessica smirked. You brought a gun to a fight you already lost. Before Holloway could react, Jessica moved. Fast. She twisted her body sideways, slamming her left arm against his wrist, forcing the gun downward. The shot fired, the sound deafening in the garage, but the bullet hit the concrete floor. In the same motion, Jessica swung her right elbow up, catching Holloway in the jaw. He stumbled back, dazed. She didn't give him time to recover. She grabbed his wrist, twisted it hard. Snap! And the gun clattered to the ground. Holloway roared in pain, but Jessica was already moving again. She grabbed his collar, yanked him forward, and slammed him against the hood of a nearby car. Holloway groaned, trying to struggle, but Jessica was stronger, faster. She grabbed a handful of his jacket and yanked him close. I don't lose, Holloway, he panted, glaring at her. You don't know what you're up against. Jessica leaned in, her voice barely a whisper. Neither do you. Then, she released him. Holloway staggered back, clutching his broken wrist. Jessica picked up his gun and emptied the magazine, tossing both pieces to the side. She dusted herself off. Now, we're going to talk. Holloway gritted his teeth. You think I'm just going to tell you everything? Jessica smiled. No, but you will. Holloway's eyes darted around, searching for an escape. He wasn't used to losing control. Jessica pulled out her phone. She tapped the screen a few times, then turned it toward him. A voice played through the speaker. His voice. Briggs is getting sloppy. If this Carter woman keeps digging, we need to handle her. And if that means putting a bullet in her brother to make her shut up, so be it. Holloway's face turned ghostly white. Jessica watched him closely. That was recorded 30 minutes ago. Do you know how? Holloway said nothing. Jessica tapped her temple. Because unlike you, I came prepared. She had bugged his car before she even confronted him. The moment he got inside and made a call, the NSA's high-frequency listening software picked it up. She had everything she needed. Holloway swallowed hard. His power, his confidence, gone. Jessica took a step closer. You're going to tell me everything, Holloway. Every name, every cop you own, every judge you have in your pocket. Holloway hesitated. Jessica's voice was ice. Because if you don't, this recording, it goes straight to the Department of Justice. And let's be honest, you won't survive what happens next. Holloway clenched his jaw. He had no choice. His empire was crumbling, and Jessica Carter was the one holding the sledgehammer. 2 hours later, an abandoned warehouse. Jessica sat across from Holloway, her arms crossed. He was slumped in a chair, his face bruised, his wrist wrapped in a makeshift bandage. She had gotten everything she needed. Names, connections, the full scope of the corruption that stretched far beyond Officer Briggs. Briggs was a pawn. Holloway was just a knight. The real king? A man named Senator Alan Whitmore. Jessica's jaw tightened as she stared at the list of transactions Holloway had given her. Whitmore had been funding Holloway's operation for years, covering up police brutality cases, discrediting victims, silencing whistleblowers. Jessica's grip on the paper tightened. Thomas had almost been one of those victims. And it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every person these men had hurt. Jessica stood up, pocketing the evidence. She glanced at Holloway, who was now staring at the ground, defeated. What happens to me now? He muttered. Jessica sighed. That depends. Holloway looked up. On what? Jessica's expression was unreadable. On whether you want to make it out of this alive. Holloway swallowed hard. Jessica turned to leave. You should get a lawyer. She walked out into the cold night, her mind racing. She had the evidence, the truth. But Whitmore was powerful. If she went after him, she had to be ready for war. Then she thought of Thomas. Of every innocent person caught in this web, Jessica Carter never backed down from a fight. And she wasn't about to start now. Meanwhile, a private estate in Washington, D.C. A man in an expensive suit sat behind a large mahogany desk. He sipped his whiskey, watching the flickering fireplace in front of him. His phone rang. He answered it without looking. Yes? A deep voice on the other end spoke. She knows. The man sighed, setting his drink down. Jessica Carter? Yes, sir. A pause. Then, the man smiled. Then let's deal with her. He hung up. Outside, the lights of Washington, D.C. glowed against the night sky. Jessica Carter had just declared war, and her enemies were ready to fight back. Jessica Carter had faced threats before. Terror cells, cybercriminals, even rogue government agents. But this was different. This was personal. She sat in her apartment, the lights dimmed, her laptop open in front of her. The files she had extracted from Holloway were displayed on the screen, rows of names and transactions staring back at her. Senator Alan Whitmore, the man pulling the strings. She had spent the last few hours mapping out his network, police precincts under his influence, judges who owed him favors, business executives laundering money for his operations. It was massive, and it was dangerous. Jessica exhaled, rubbing her temples. She had everything she needed to bring him down. But that was the problem. Whitmore wasn't just some corrupt official. He was a U.S. senator, a man with power, connections, and the kind of reach that could make people disappear. If she went after him, there was no turning back, and she had no illusions about what that meant. The phone buzzed on the table. She picked it up, expecting a call from one of her contacts, but the number was unknown. Jessica hesitated. Then, she answered. Silence. Then, a deep voice. Smooth. Calm. You've been busy, Miss Carter. Jessica's grip tightened. Who is this? The voice chuckled. You already know. Jessica's jaw clenched. Whitmore. Another chuckle. Smart girl. She leaned back in her chair. If you're calling to threaten me, I'm going to have to disappoint you. I don't scare easily. Whitmore sighed. Jessica. This isn't a threat. It's an opportunity. Jessica frowned. Opportunity? Whitmore's voice remained calm. I've read your file. I know what you're capable of. You're impressive. Efficient. Precise. The kind of person we could use. Jessica scoffed. You're offering me a job? In a manner of speaking, Jessica let out a short laugh. You really think I'd work for you? Whitmore sighed again. You have two options, Miss Carter. Walk away, and I make sure your brother is released. No harm. No charges. He walks free. You get your life back. Jessica said nothing. Whitmore continued. Or you keep pushing, and I promise you, the next time you hear your brother's name, it won't be because he's being released. Jessica's fingers curled into a fist. Whitmore's voice lowered. Walk away, Jessica. It's the only way you both survive this. Jessica took a slow breath, forcing herself to stay calm. Then she smiled. You just made a mistake. Whitmore paused. Oh. Jessica leaned forward. You should have killed me when you had the chance. Silence. Then, Whitmore chuckled again. Suit yourself. The line went dead. Jessica set the phone down, her heartbeat steady. This wasn't a fight anymore. It was war. 1 hour later, a secret NSA safe house. Jessica didn't go home. She knew they were watching her apartment. Instead, she made her way to an NSA safe house, a secure location known only to a handful of agents. She wasn't alone. A man in his late 50s sat across from her, his dark eyes serious. His name was David Kessler, a former NSA director turned independent operative, and he was one of the few people Jessica trusted. Kessler sighed, rubbing his face. You really know how to find trouble, Carter. Jessica smirked. It usually finds me first. Kessler shook his head. You're going after Whitmore? Jessica nodded. Kessler exhaled. Then you need to be ready. Jessica met his gaze. I am. Kessler leaned forward. No, you're not. Jessica frowned. Kessler continued. Whitmore doesn't just have money and power. He has people, mercenaries, government contacts. And if he knows you're coming, he won't just try to scare you. Jessica's eyes darkened. I know. Kessler studied her for a long moment, then sighed. All right, then let's bring him down. Jessica's lips curled into a smirk. Now we're talking. Meanwhile, a private airfield outside D.C. The black SUV rolled to a stop near the hangar. Inside, Senator Alan Whitmore sat in the back seat, swirling a glass of whiskey. A man in tactical gear stood beside the vehicle, waiting. Whitmore took a slow sip before speaking. She's not backing down. The man nodded. We expected that. Whitmore sighed, setting his drink down. Then it's time to end this. The man nodded again. How do you want it handled? Whitmore looked out the window, watching the private jet being fueled. Then he smirked. Make it loud. The man didn't ask questions. He simply nodded and walked away. Back at the safe house, 2:17 a.m. Jessica sat at the table, reviewing the final pieces of evidence. Kessler had called in some favors, securing classified documents that linked Whitmore to not just police corruption, but high-level black ops missions gone wrong. This was bigger than she thought, and that meant she had to move fast. A sudden buzz made her glance at her phone. A message. Unknown number. You have 30 minutes to run. Jessica's stomach dropped. She sprang to her feet. Kessler, we need to... Boom. The explosion ripped through the night, shattering the windows, blowing the door off its hinges. Jessica was thrown backward, hitting the floor hard. Her ears rang. Smoke filled the room. Somewhere through the chaos, she heard gunfire. They had found her, and they weren't here to scare her. They were here to kill her. Jessica Carter's ears were ringing. The explosion had been close, too close. Smoke filled the air, thick and suffocating. The walls of the safe house trembled as debris rained down. She forced herself to move, her instincts kicking in before logic could catch up. Her muscles burned as she rolled onto her side, coughing through the haze. Her eyes darted around the destroyed room, searching for Kessler. Then she saw him. Kessler was slumped against the far wall, blood trickling down his forehead. His breathing was shallow, but he was alive. Jessica pushed herself up, ignoring the pain in her ribs. The gunfire outside was growing louder. Boots pounded against the pavement. They were coming. She staggered over to Kessler, shaking his shoulder. "David, wake up." Kessler groaned, his eyelids fluttering open. He blinked a few times before his gaze focused on her. "Damn," he muttered. "That was a hell of a wake-up call." Jessica didn't waste time. "Can you move?" Kessler gritted his teeth and nodded. "Yeah, just give me a second." They didn't have a second. A shadow moved near the blown-out doorway. Jessica reacted instantly, grabbing the pistol from Kessler's belt. She fired. The first bullet hit the figure in the chest. The second struck him between the eyes. The man crumpled to the floor, his rifle clattering beside him. Jessica turned back to Kessler. "We need to get out of here." Kessler pushed himself up with a grunt. "Agreed." More figures appeared in the doorway. This time, they weren't waiting. Gunfire erupted. Jessica ducked, pulling Kessler down with her. Bullets tore through what remained of the safe house, shattering furniture and embedding themselves in the walls. She fired back, taking down another attacker. But they kept coming. Too many. Kessler pulled a small device from his pocket and pressed a button. A hidden door on the far wall slid open. Jessica didn't hesitate. She grabbed Kessler's arm and pulled him toward it. "Move." They sprinted into the tunnel just as another explosion rocked the building behind them. The escape in New York City Underground. The tunnel was dark, damp, and smelled of rust. It stretched out ahead of them, disappearing into the shadows. Kessler limped slightly, but he kept moving. "You ever gonna tell me why I keep getting shot at every time I work with you?" Jessica smirked. "Maybe you should pick better friends." Kessler let out a dry chuckle, then winced. "I think I cracked a rib." Jessica kept her gun raised as they moved. "You'll live." They reached a rusted ladder at the end of the tunnel. Jessica climbed first, pushing open a heavy grate that led to the streets above. She peeked out. Clear. She climbed out and helped Kessler up after her. They were in an alleyway, the city moving normally around them, unaware of the chaos they had just escaped. Kessler exhaled. "Okay, that was close." Jessica's jaw tightened. Too close. She checked her phone. The screen was cracked, but it still worked. She sent a message. "Carter, they found us. I need a clean exit." The reply came almost instantly. "Unknown contact. Location?" Jessica looked around. "We need to move," she told Kessler. "They're not done." Kessler nodded. "Where to?" Jessica's expression hardened. "To the one person who can take Whitmore down." Meanwhile, Senator Whitmore's estate. Alan Whitmore poured himself another glass of whiskey, standing in his massive study. A large screen displayed a satellite feed of the destroyed NSA safehouse. He smirked. A man in a suit stood behind him, arms crossed. "She survived," the man said. Whitmore sighed. "Of course she did. That woman is a cockroach." The man didn't smile. "She won't stop." Whitmore swirled his drink. "She will." The man raised an eyebrow. "And if she doesn't?" Whitmore took a slow sip, then turned around. "Then we stop playing games." His eyes darkened. "And we kill her properly." Jessica Carter and David Kessler moved through the city with purpose, their steps quick but controlled. They had less than an hour before Whitmore's men would find them again. Maybe less. Jessica's contact had sent coordinates, an old warehouse near the Hudson River. It was isolated, secure, and most importantly, off the grid. As they walked, Kessler exhaled sharply, clutching his side. "Remind me why I'm still helping you?" Jessica smirked but didn't slow down. "Because you hate corrupt politicians." Kessler grumbled. "Not enough to get blown up for it." Jessica glanced at him. "You're still here." Kessler sighed. Yeah. They turned a corner, slipping through a narrow alleyway. Jessica spotted the warehouse up ahead. The entrance was a rusted steel door, barely visible from the street. Jessica knocked 3 times, paused, then knocked twice more. A second later, the door cracked open. A woman peered out, sharp eyes scanning them before opening the door fully. She was in her early 40s, with short dark hair and an air of quiet authority. Lisa Monroe, former CIA analyst, now an independent operative. Carter, Lisa said, stepping aside to let them in. You look like hell. Jessica walked past her. Feels about right. Kessler followed, groaning. I definitely cracked a rib. Lisa shut the door, locking it behind them. The warehouse was mostly empty except for a few old desks, a set of computer monitors, and stacks of files. Jessica turned to Lisa. I need your help. Lisa smirked. Figured. You only show up when things are about to get messy. Jessica handed her a flash drive. This has everything. Transactions, names, connections between Whitmore, Holloway, and half the corrupt law enforcement in the city. Lisa took the drive, plugging it into her laptop. She scanned the files, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern. Damn, she muttered. You weren't kidding. This is big. Jessica nodded. I need it out in the open. Now. Lisa's fingers flew over the keyboard. I can drop this into a few places. A couple of journalists, a watchdog group, maybe even a federal oversight committee. Jessica frowned. That's not enough. Whitmore has people everywhere. He'll bury this before it gets traction. Lisa leaned back. Then what's your plan? Jessica's eyes were cold. We take him down before he has the chance. Kessler sighed. Of course we do. Lisa raised an eyebrow. And how exactly do we do that? Jessica hesitated. Then she spoke. I need to get inside Whitmore's estate. Lisa blinked. You want to break into a U.S. senator's house? Jessica didn't flinch. I want to plant evidence. Something undeniable. Something even his allies can't cover up. Lisa exhaled. You're insane. Kessler nodded. I second that. Jessica crossed her arms. Can you do it or not? Lisa studied her for a moment. Then she smirked. You're lucky I like a challenge. Meanwhile, Whitmore's estate. Alan Whitmore paced his study, his expression dark. The first attempt on Jessica had failed. She was still alive. And now, she had evidence. Whitmore turned to the man standing by the fireplace, Elias Kane, his personal fixer, a man who made problems disappear. Kane's face was unreadable. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in an expensive black suit. Unlike the mercenaries Whitmore had sent before, Kane was different. Smarter. Deadlier. Whitmore poured another drink. She's making this difficult. Kane's voice was calm. She's resourceful. Trained. Predictable. Whitmore scowled. If she's so predictable, why isn't she dead yet? Kane's lips twitched in the faintest hint of a smile. Because you underestimated her. Whitmore stiffened. Kane took a step forward. I won't. Whitmore narrowed his eyes. You're sure? Kane nodded. Give me 24 hours. Whitmore hesitated. Then, he handed Kane a file. Make it clean. Kane glanced at the papers inside. Details on Jessica Carter. Her movements. Associates. A recent image from a security camera. Kane closed the file. Then, he walked out without another word. Whitmore exhaled. One way or another, Jessica Carter wouldn't live to see the end of this. That night, outside Whitmore's estate, Jessica crouched behind a row of bushes, her dark clothing blending into the shadows. A mile behind her, Lisa was stationed in a van, monitoring security feeds. All right, Carter. Lisa's voice crackled in her earpiece. You've got 2 perimeter guards. North side has a motion sensor. East side has cameras. You're clear for 90 seconds before the next patrol. Jessica smirked. Plenty of time. She moved swiftly, keeping low, slipping past the guards with ease. She reached the side entrance, pulling out a small device from her pocket. A few quick clicks, and the electronic lock blinked green. She was in. The hallway was silent. Dark. Jessica moved carefully, her footsteps light against the marble floor. She knew where she was going, Whitmore's office. If she could access his personal computer, She could retrieve internal emails, confidential documents, things even he couldn't erase. She turned a corner and froze. A man stood at the end of the hallway, watching her. Not a guard, not a mercenary. Jessica's instinct screamed danger. The man took a slow step forward. Jessica Carter. His voice was deep, controlled. Jessica's fingers twitched toward her weapon. Who are you? The man smiled slightly. My name is Elias Kane. Jessica's breath hitched. She knew that name. Kane was a ghost. A government operative turned fixer. No official records, no digital footprint. The kind of man who didn't just eliminate threats. He erased them completely. Jessica's mind raced. This wasn't a standard hit. This was personal. Kane took another step. You should have walked away. Jessica clenched her jaw. So should you. Then she moved. Fast. She drew her gun. But Kane was faster. In a blink, he was in front of her, his hand slamming into her wrist. The gun flew from her grip. Jessica reacted instantly, throwing a sharp elbow toward his ribs. Kane blocked it, twisting her arm behind her back. Pain shot up her shoulder, but Jessica didn't hesitate. She shifted her weight, kicking off the wall, using the momentum to flip them both. They crashed onto the floor, rolling. Jessica fought, but Kane was strong, calculated. He pinned her down, pressing a blade to her throat. His voice was calm. This is where it ends. Jessica's pulse pounded. Her mind raced. She had seconds. Think, Carter. Then, she saw it. A small metal pin light clipped to his belt. A tactical distraction device. She grabbed it, pressed the button. A blinding flash filled the hallway. Kane cursed, his grip loosening just enough. Jessica twisted free, delivering a brutal knee to his gut. He staggered back. She didn't wait. She grabbed her gun and ran. Behind her, Kane growled, pushing himself up. The hunt wasn't over. It had just begun. Jessica Carter ran. The hallways of Whitmore's estate blurred around her as adrenaline surged through her veins. She could still feel the heat of Elias Kane's knife against her throat, the weight of his grip pinning her down. He was faster than anyone she had ever fought before. Smarter. And he wasn't far behind. Lisa, Jessica hissed into her earpiece as she sprinted toward the West Wing. I've been made. Lisa's voice crackled in response. I told you this was insane. What happened? Jessica risked a glance over her shoulder. Kane was already up, moving fast. His eyes locked onto hers, determined. Jessica cursed under her breath. I ran into someone. Someone very bad. Lisa was typing furiously on her end. You need an exit now. Jessica skidded around a corner and saw what she was looking for, Whitmore's office. A massive oak door with biometric security. Forget the exit, she said, breathing hard. I still need the files. Lisa's voice rose. Are you kidding me? You barely got away from whoever that was. You need to. Jessica shut off the earpiece. She didn't have time for an argument. She reached the door, pulled out her hacking tool, and pressed it against the biometric scanner. The device hummed as it started to override the system. Seconds stretched. Footsteps behind her. Jessica turned, raising her gun. Kane stepped into view, moving like a shadow. His breathing was steady, his hands empty. No gun, no weapon. Jessica didn't lower her gun. Stay back. Kane smirked. You won't shoot me. Jessica's grip tightened. You really want to bet your life on that? Kane tilted his head slightly, studying her like a puzzle. You're not reckless. You're methodical. Tactical. He took another step. And you don't kill unless you have to. Jessica's pulse pounded. He was right. But he didn't know just how close she was to making an exception. The hacking device beeped. The lock released. Jessica didn't hesitate. She shoved the door open and slipped inside, slamming it behind her. She heard Kane's steps quicken, but she was already moving. The office was massive, lined with bookshelves and old paintings. A large mahogany desk sat in the center, Whitmore's personal computer resting on top. Jessica yanked out a flash drive and plugged it in. Lisa's voice came through her earpiece again. Jessica, what are you doing? Jessica typed furiously, downloading every file on Whitmore's system. Lisa cursed. You have 1 minute, max. And your new friend out there? He's probably about to kick the door down. Jessica didn't respond. She watched the progress bar inch forward. 10%, 30%, 50%. Boom. The door exploded inward. Jessica barely had time to duck before Kane stormed in. His suit barely wrinkled, his expression unreadable. Jessica grabbed a lamp from the desk and threw it at him. Kane swatted it aside like it was nothing. Jessica reached for her gun, but Kane was faster. He closed the distance in seconds, grabbing her wrist and twisting. Pain shot up her arm as her gun clattered to the floor. Jessica fought back, striking with her free hand. But Kane anticipated her moves. He dodged, countered, controlled the fight. She lashed out with a sharp kick. Kane caught her leg and threw her. Jessica crashed into a bookshelf, sending books tumbling to the floor. Her vision blurred. Kane stepped closer. "It's over, Carter." Jessica's fingers curled around something solid. Not a weapon. A hard drive. Her mind snapped into focus. Not over. Not yet. She pushed up onto her feet. "You talk too much." Kane raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" Jessica launched the hard drive at the computer screen. The glass shattered, sparks flying. Kane's eyes flickered in surprise. Just enough of a distraction. Jessica grabbed the flash drive from the computer and sprinted toward the window. Kane cursed and lunged, but Jessica was already gone. She crashed through the glass, the city skyline spinning around her. For a split second, she was weightless. Then she hit the rooftop below, rolling hard. Pain shot through her shoulder, but she ignored it. Behind her, Kane stood at the broken window, watching. He didn't chase her. He didn't need to. Instead, he smirked. Jessica didn't like that smirk. Then she turned and ran. Lisa's safe house, 2:30 a.m. Lisa paced back and forth, arms crossed. "I hate working with you." Jessica sat on the couch, cradling an ice pack against her shoulder. "You love it." Lisa groaned. "You jumped out of a window." Jessica held up the flash drive. "And I got what we needed." Lisa snatched it from her. "If I ever end up in federal prison, I'm blaming you." Kessler sat nearby, bandaging his ribs. "So, was it worth it?" Jessica's expression turned serious. "We'll find out." Lisa plugged the drive into her laptop, scrolling through the files. Then she froze. Jessica leaned forward. "What?" Lisa's face paled. "Carter, this isn't just about corruption." Jessica frowned. "What do you mean?" Lisa turned the screen toward them. Whitmore's files weren't just about bribes or illegal arrests. They were about assassinations, government officials, business leaders, journalists, people who had mysteriously disappeared. Jessica's breath caught. Whitmore wasn't just corrupt. He was running a shadow operation. Kessler exhaled. "We're in deep." Lisa swallowed hard. "Deeper than we thought." Jessica clenched her fists. She had started this fight to save her brother. Now, she was going to bring all of them down. Meanwhile, Whitmore's estate. Whitmore stood in his office, staring at the shattered window. Kane sat nearby, calm as ever. Whitmore's jaw tightened. "She got away." Kane smirked. "For now." Whitmore turned. "She has the files." Kane nodded. "Yes." Whitmore clenched his fists. "Then why do you look pleased?" Kane leaned back. "Because she thinks she won." Whitmore frowned. "She did." Kane's smirk widened. "Not yet." Whitmore stared at him. "Explain." Kane poured himself a drink, taking a slow sip before answering. "Jessica Carter is the best at what she does." He set the glass down. "But so am I." Whitmore's eyes narrowed. "Meaning?" Kane's smirk vanished. "Meaning I let her take the drive." Whitmore's pulse spiked. "You." Kane stood, adjusting his suit. "There's a tracker on it." Whitmore inhaled sharply. Kane's voice was low. "Now, we know exactly where she is." A slow smile spread across Whitmore's face. Jessica Carter thought she was ahead. But the real game was just beginning. Jessica Carter sat in the dimly lit safe house, staring at the files on Lisa's laptop. The air felt heavier now, the weight of what they had uncovered pressing down on them. This wasn't just about police corruption. This was state-sponsored murder. Dozens of names. Journalists who had gone missing. Whistleblowers who had suffered accidents. Even former government agents, People like her, who had been quietly eliminated. Jessica clenched her jaw. Whitmore isn't just corrupt. He's a killer. Lisa scrolled through the files, her face pale. This isn't just him, Carter. This is an entire network. Jessica's heart pounded. Whitmore was the face of it, but behind him was an entire machine. Contractors, black ops teams, government officials who pulled the strings in the shadows. And now? Now they knew that she knew. Lisa swallowed hard. We need to go public with this. Now. Jessica exhaled. We will. But we need to be smart. Kessler, who had been silent, finally spoke. Smart? Carter, they're going to come for us. We need to disappear. Jessica looked at him. No. Kessler narrowed his eyes. No. Jessica's voice was steel. We don't run. We end this. Lisa frowned. How? You think we can just send this to the media and watch Whitmore get arrested? He owns half the government. He'll bury this before it even makes the news. Jessica knew she was right. Whitmore had been cleaning up his messes for years. But she had one advantage. Whitmore had never faced someone like her. Jessica stood, her mind racing. We need leverage. We need a confession. Kessler scoffed. Oh, sure. Let's just ask a U.S. senator to admit on camera that he's a murderer. Jessica smirked. Exactly. Lisa stared. You're not serious. Jessica's eyes darkened. I'm very serious. Lisa shook her head. Even if we could get close enough, how do you plan to make him talk? Jessica's lips curled. By making him think he already lost. Meanwhile, Elias Kane's black SUV. Elias Kane watched the blinking red on his tablet. Jessica Carter's location. She thought she had one. She thought she had outplayed them. She was wrong. Kane turned to his driver. Bring the team. Full tactical gear. The driver nodded. Kane smirked. This was going to be fun. Back at the safe house, 3 a.m. Jessica and Lisa worked fast. Lisa was already patching into Whitmore's security systems, pulling up blueprints of his estate. Kessler was loading weapons, shaking his head the entire time. This is a terrible idea, he muttered. Jessica ignored him. Lisa, can you fake an NSA breach? Lisa's fingers flew over the keyboard. If you give me 5 minutes and a lot of coffee, I can fake a moon landing. Jessica smirked. Good. Lisa glanced up. You want to make Whitmore think the NSA is after him? Jessica nodded. We leak just enough to make him panic. Make him think someone inside his own network betrayed him. Kessler sighed. And then what? He just confesses out of the kindness of his heart? Jessica's expression hardened. No. He calls whoever he trusts most. And we'll be listening. Lisa grinned. You really are scary. Jessica picked up her gun. You have no idea. 1 hour later, Whitmore's estate. Senator Alan Whitmore sat in his study, swirling a glass of whiskey. Then his phone rang. He answered immediately. Talk. The voice on the other end was frantic. Sir, we have a problem. The NSA just flagged one of our accounts. They've been tracing our offshore transactions. Whitmore's grip on his glass tightened. How? We don't know. But they have a file. Your name is all over it. Whitmore shot up from his chair. This wasn't supposed to happen. Who leaked it? We think it was someone inside. Whitmore's blood ran cold. A traitor. His mind raced. If the NSA had even a fraction of his records, he was finished. Whitmore turned toward his desk. He needed to move money. Wipe records. Make a few people disappear. He needed Kane. He dialed another number. A cold voice answered. Sir. Whitmore exhaled sharply. I need a cleanup. Silence. Then Kane's voice lowered. Senator, we have a problem. Whitmore's stomach dropped. What? Kane sighed. Jessica Carter. Whitmore's hands clenched into fists. Is she dead? A pause. No. Whitmore's pulse spiked. Then Kane's voice turned cold. But you will be. Whitmore's breath hitched. What? Static. Then. I hope you're comfortable, Senator. Because your entire conversation just got broadcasted. Whitmore froze. The voice wasn't Kane's. It was Jessica Carter's. His blood turned to ice. No, he whispered. Jessica's voice was smooth. Yes. Then, the line went dead. The next morning, news broadcasts across the country. Every major network played the recording. Alan Whitmore, talking about cover-ups, murders. His empire collapsed in real time. The FBI raided his estate. His allies scrambled, turning on him to save themselves. And Elias Kane? Gone. Disappeared without a trace. A week later, at a rooftop in New York, Jessica stood alone, looking out over the city. She had won. Her brother was free. Whitmore was finished. But something still didn't sit right. Kane, he had let her win, which meant this wasn't over. Not yet. Her phone buzzed. She checked the screen. Unknown number. Good move, Carter. Jessica's heart pounded. She typed back, Carter, where are you? A pause. Then, unknown number. Closer than you think. Jessica inhaled slowly. Then she smiled. The game wasn't over. And neither was she. Jessica Carter didn't move. She stared at the message on her phone, the glowing screen casting a faint light against the night. Closer than you think. Her eyes flicked up, scanning the city skyline, the rooftops, the alleyways below. Elias Kane was out there, watching. Jessica exhaled slowly, slipping her phone back into her pocket. She wasn't surprised. Kane was too smart to go down with Whitmore. But what was surprising? He wanted her to know he was still in the game. Jessica's instincts screamed at her. Kane didn't make mistakes. If he had wanted her dead, she wouldn't be standing here. Which meant he had plans. And that was more dangerous than anything. A voice crackled in her earpiece. Carter, you good? It was Lisa, monitoring from her station across town. Jessica kept her voice calm. He made contact. Lisa cursed. That didn't take long. You trace it? Jessica sighed. No signal. He's too careful. Lisa exhaled. Figures. Jessica's fingers curled into fists. Whitmore was gone. The media had torn him apart, the government scrambling to distance itself from his crimes. But Kane? Kane was a different beast. And something told Jessica this wasn't over. Not even close. Meanwhile, an abandoned safe house in Virginia. Elias Kane sat in a dimly lit room, the glow of his laptop screen flickering against the dark walls. Jessica Carter. She had been impressive. More than impressive. She had done something no one else had. She had outplayed him. Kane leaned back in his chair, rubbing his jaw. He should have killed her when he had the chance. But something about her fascinated him. She wasn't reckless. She wasn't driven by revenge. She was precise, methodical. And now, she was hunting him. Kane smirked. Good. He loved a challenge. 2 days later, a warehouse in Brooklyn. Jessica moved quietly through the abandoned warehouse, her gun drawn. Lisa's voice whispered in her earpiece. You sure about this, Carter? Jessica scanned the shadows. No. Lisa sighed. Great. Jessica had received another message that morning. Midnight. Warehouse district. Alone. It wasn't signed, but she knew exactly who it was from. And she had come anyway. She reached the center of the warehouse. The moonlight filtered through shattered windows, casting long shadows. Then, a slow clap echoed through the space. Jessica's pulse remained steady, but she tightened her grip on the gun. A figure stepped into the light. Elias Kane, dressed in black, calm, amused. Jessica didn't lower her weapon. You've got nerve. Kane smirked. I could say the same about you. Jessica didn't blink. You called me here. Why? Kane tilted his head. Because you're interesting. Jessica exhaled sharply. Try again. Kane stepped closer. All right. Because you and I? We're not that different. Jessica scoffed. I don't kill for money. Kane smirked. You kill for your cause. I kill for mine. Jessica clenched her jaw. Kane continued. Whitmore was a fool. A man who thought power made him untouchable. He was sloppy, arrogant, and now he's gone. Jessica narrowed her eyes. And you? What are you? Kane's smile faded. I'm what comes next. Jessica's heart pounded. Meaning? Kane took another step. Meaning you think this is over. It's not. Jessica kept her gun steady. Why don't you tell me what is next? Kane's lips curled slightly. I will. But not here. Jessica inhaled slowly. She wasn't sure what game he was playing, but she knew one thing. Elias Kane never met people unless he had something to offer, and that meant he needed her. which was very bad news. Kane gestured toward the door. Let's take a walk. Jessica hesitated. Lisa's voice whispered in her earpiece. Carter, whatever you're thinking, don't do it. Jessica ignored her. She lowered her gun. And then, she followed him. 1 hour later, a private lounge in Manhattan. The restaurant was closed to the public. Low lighting. Private booths. Security at every exit. Jessica sat across from Kane, her arms crossed. I'm listening, she said. Kane sipped his drink. There's another player in this game, Carter. Someone bigger than Whitmore. Jessica's pulse remained steady. Who? Kane smirked. Ever hear of the Dominion Group? Jessica's blood ran cold. She had heard of them. A covert organization. Wealthy elites. Shadow deals. The kind of people who didn't just control politics. They controlled everything. Jessica leaned forward. And let me guess, you work for them? Kane's smirk didn't fade. Not anymore. Jessica studied him. They cut you loose? Kane's expression darkened. Something like that. Jessica exhaled. And now you want to take them down? Kane set his glass down. I want to survive. Jessica didn't move. For the first time, she saw it. A crack in his armor. Elias Kane was many things. Ruthless, cunning, deadly. But now? Now he was running. Jessica leaned back. You're scared. Kane's jaw tightened. Jessica smirked. That's new. Kane exhaled sharply. You don't get it, Carter. Whitmore was a puppet. A distraction. The real power? He met her gaze. They're still watching. Jessica's breath slowed. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. Jessica Carter stared at Elias Kane across the dimly lit lounge. The ice in her drink had long since melted, but she hadn't touched it. Her fingers tapped against the edge of the table, her mind processing every word he had just said. The Dominion Group. An invisible hand behind everything. Governments. Corporations. Wars. And Whitmore? He was just a pawn. Jessica exhaled. You're telling me you worked for them? Kane's expression remained unreadable. For a time, Jessica narrowed her eyes. And now they're hunting you? Kane smirked, but there was no humor in it. They don't let people leave. Jessica tilted her head. And you expect me to believe that you, one of the most dangerous men I've ever met, are running scared? Kane leaned forward. I'm not running, Carter. His voice was quiet but sharp. I'm preparing. Jessica studied him. Every instinct told her not to trust him. Kane had been Whitmore's personal fixer. A ghost. A weapon. He had tried to kill her. And now, he was sitting across from her, acting like an ally. Jessica exhaled. What do you want? Kane tapped the table lightly. The same thing you do. Jessica arched an eyebrow. Kane smirked. To bring them down. Jessica let out a short laugh. That's cute. You think I'm stupid? Kane leaned back. I think you're smart enough to know this doesn't end with Whitmore. He folded his hands. They let him take the fall, Carter. They needed a scapegoat. And now, they're covering their tracks. Jessica's stomach tightened. She had thought she won. That Whitmore's downfall meant justice. But if Kane was right, she had only burned the decoy, while the real monster still lurked in the shadows. Jessica met his gaze. Why do you care? Kane's expression darkened. Because they betrayed me. Jessica exhaled. And let me guess, you can't fight them alone. Kane's lips curled slightly. Neither can you. Jessica clenched her jaw. She hated that he was right. She had spent her career exposing corruption, dismantling threats from the inside. But the Dominion Group? This wasn't a dirty senator or a corrupt cop. This was a system. Jessica let the silence stretch. Then she spoke. You want me to work with you? Kane's smirk returned. I want you to survive. Jessica exhaled. She weighed her options. Walk away, and she could disappear. Start fresh. But could she live knowing she let them win? No. She leaned forward. You screw me over once, and I will bury you myself. Kane chuckled. I'd expect nothing less. Jessica extended her hand. Kane hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, then shook it. It was a deal. 1 week later, a private jet. Jessica looked out the window as the jet lifted off, the New York skyline shrinking below. Lisa had not been happy about her decision. Kessler had flat out called her insane. But they both knew Jessica Carter didn't walk away from a fight. Not when the stakes were this high. Kane sat across from her, reading a dossier. He glanced up. You ready for this? Jessica smirked. I was born ready. Kane nodded. Good. He slid a folder across the table. Jessica opened it. Inside were names, locations, photos of powerful men and women who thought they were untouchable. Jessica's pulse quickened. The game wasn't over. It was just beginning. She looked up, meeting Kane's eyes. Let's burn it all down. Kane smirked. Now you're speaking my language. The plane disappeared into the clouds, and Jessica Carter disappeared with it. The world never learned the full story. The media had torn into Alan Whitmore's crimes, exposing a senator who had abused his power, but they never saw the real monster lurking behind him. Jessica Carter had disappeared. Officially, she was dead. Unofficially, she was hunting. 6 months later, somewhere in Europe, a man in a tailored suit walked briskly through the streets of Prague, his breath fogging in the cold night air. His name was William Torrance, a high-ranking executive for Dominion International, a subsidiary of the Dominion Group. He was important. He was protected. And yet, he felt a presence behind him, a shadow that didn't belong. His heartbeat quickened. He turned a corner, picking up his pace. His security detail was waiting just ahead, 2 men standing by a sleek black car. He exhaled in relief. Then he blinked. The men were gone. Torrance froze. His breath hitched as he realized something was very, very wrong. He turned and came face to face with her. Jessica Carter, dressed in black, eyes sharp, unrelenting. Torrance's mouth went dry. I don't know who you are, but... Jessica smirked. You know exactly who I am. Torrance swallowed. He took a step back. Listen, whatever you think you're doing, you're making a mistake. These people, you can't fight them. Jessica tilted her head. That's what Whitmore thought. Torrance's face paled. Jessica leaned in slightly, her voice ice cold. You're going to tell me everything. Torrance shook his head rapidly. No, you don't understand. They'll kill me. Jessica smirked. Not if I get to them first. Torrance saw something in her eyes then. A fire that wouldn't burn out. He had spent his life hiding behind power. Behind men like Whitmore. Behind the illusion of control. But standing before Jessica Carter, he understood something. The game had changed. The old world of silent corruption and untouchable elites? It was burning, and she was the one lighting the match. Torrance's hands trembled. Okay, he whispered. Jessica smiled. Good choice. 1 year later, Washington, D.C. A confidential memo circulated through the halls of the intelligence community. Subject: Jessica Carter. Status: unknown. The report listed anomalies. Whistleblowers had begun talking. Offshore accounts were being frozen. Private military contractors had vanished overnight. Someone was moving against them. One analyst, reading the report, scribbled a final note at the bottom of the page. They thought she was dead. They were wrong. She's still out there. And she's winning. Final scene: a distant shore. Jessica Carter stood on a quiet beach, the waves crashing softly against the shore. The sky burned orange with the setting sun. She pulled out her phone. A single message blinked on the screen. Kane, next target secured. Awaiting your move. Jessica smiled to herself. She had won the first battle. But the war? It was far from over. She typed her response. Carter, we move at dawn. She put the phone away and turned toward the horizon. Jessica Carter was no longer a soldier. She was a reckoning. And for the people who had built their empire on corruption and fear, their time was running out. The fire had only just begun.